It all began the morning I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, only to find an empty spot where my prized tomatoes had sat just yesterday. I stood frozen, staring dramatically at the gaping space like a father mourning the disappearance of his favorite child. You might think that's an overreaction, but these weren't just tomatoes. They were my pride, joy, and frankly, my only escape from the daily grind. Plus, gardening was cheaper than therapy. As I stood there professing my loss, I glanced suspiciously around the neighborhood. Peaceful suburbs, manicured lawns, and smiling neighbors suddenly felt sinister. Someone had dared trespass onto my property and snatched away my perfect, sun-ripened tomatoes, and I was going to find out who. I took a deep breath and reminded myself this wasn't a high-stakes detective thriller yet. Perhaps it was a fluke or a hungry squirrel with unusually sophisticated tastes. Still, the image of a raccoon enjoying an extravagant tomato feast at my expense was somehow comforting compared to the alternative. Someone from the neighborhood was sabotaging my beloved garden. Pushing away paranoia, I walked into the house, determined not to overthink things. But peace didn't last long. 2 days later, it happened again. Except this time, the thief didn't even have the decency to leave behind evidence. They'd snatched my tomatoes clean, leaving only sad, leafy remnants of their former glory. My frustration began boiling over. Determined not to surrender to tomato terrorists, I decided it was time to investigate properly. Armed with my phone camera and a newly purchased wireless security camera system, I began my career as a part-time gardener and full-time detective. My prime suspect quickly became Brenda. Yes, that Brenda, the infamous president of our homeowners association, known throughout the neighborhood for her meticulous lawn inspections, passive-aggressive emails, and dedication to enforcing rules nobody else seemed to know existed. Brenda had always seemed overly interested in my garden, especially my tomatoes. On several occasions, she'd openly critique them during her routine inspections, once going so far as suggesting I use more symmetrical tomato cages to maintain community standards. I knew she disliked my casual approach to gardening, and frankly, I took pleasure in annoying her by deliberately ignoring her overly detailed gardening tips. I decided I'd start by casually observing her, looking for clues. I didn't need to wait long for suspicious activity. Later that same evening, while watering my plants and feigning complete innocence, I noticed Brenda walking her miniature poodle, Duchess, past my property. Her eyes narrowed at my tomatoes, or rather, at the sad stubs that had once held juicy fruits. When she saw me watching, she flashed an overly bright smile, raised her hand dramatically in greeting, and remarked, "Oh, what a shame about your tomatoes. Guess gardening isn't for everyone." Her voice carried just enough condescension to raise my suspicions further. I smiled politely and mumbled something about pesky raccoons, though in my heart, I suspected a more malicious animal at play, one wearing pastel cardigans and sensible shoes. After Brenda had passed, I swiftly set up my surveillance camera discreetly among the leaves, feeling like a spy conducting a daring undercover operation. I carefully concealed the camera, adjusted the angle, and checked my phone. Perfect. If Brenda, or whoever was sabotaging my garden, returned, I'd capture undeniable evidence. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, anxiously checking the footage from the previous night. Initially, nothing seemed unusual. Birds chirped innocently in the background, a gentle breeze rustled leaves, and then suddenly, there she was, Brenda, wearing what could only be described as her stealth mode gardening gloves, a comically oversized straw hat, and pink Crocs. Brenda casually approached my plants as if strolling through a grocery aisle. My jaw literally dropped as I watched her reach out, pick a perfectly ripe tomato, and tuck it confidently into a small bag at her side, glancing nervously around as if stealing a tomato was an international crime worthy of the FBI's most wanted list. I sat stunned, emotions swirling between rage, disbelief, and uncontrollable laughter. It felt utterly ridiculous, yet painfully personal. Brenda, my HOA nemesis, wasn't just criticizing my gardening skills. She was literally robbing me of the fruits of my labor. The nerve, the absurdity, the sheer audacity. Part of me wondered if she'd planned a neighborhood tomato salad party using stolen produce, perhaps served with a generous helping of hypocrisy. But after my initial amusement faded, determination quickly filled its place. This wasn't just petty theft, it was personal. Brenda had crossed the line, and it was time for payback. But not ordinary payback, no. My revenge had to be as memorable as it was satisfying. And that's when inspiration struck like lightning. Scrolling through my phone, I landed on a video titled Carolina Reaper Pepper Challenge. A grin slowly spread across my face as I watched the video, seeing grown adults cry hysterically, faces red and sweating uncontrollably from the heat. Yes, this was perfect. I would secretly plant Carolina Reapers, the hottest peppers on earth, disguised cleverly among my tomatoes. Brenda's next theft would be her last, at least her last comfortable one. My frustration morphed into excitement as I imagined her confidently biting into a pepper, expecting juicy sweetness, but instead unleashing fiery chaos. Oh, how poetic justice could be. Before long, I found myself enthusiastically shopping at the local gardening store, idly explaining to a bemused cashier that yes, I was indeed voluntarily planting the world's hottest peppers next to my tomatoes. The cashier's raised eyebrows spoke volumes, but I didn't care. Soon, I'd have the perfect bait. Within hours, I was carefully planting Carolina Reaper seedlings amongst my tomatoes, silently apologizing to the unsuspecting peppers for their dangerous mission ahead. As I stood back admiring my work, anticipation built within me like never before. Brenda had no idea what was coming, and quite honestly, neither did I. Little did I know that planting these fiery peppers would soon ignite something far more explosive than I ever imagined. As the days passed, I carefully nurtured my secret weapon, the Carolina Reapers, with a mixture of pride, excitement, and mild guilt. Watching them grow was oddly therapeutic, knowing their true purpose was revenge. My tomatoes had been harmless and peaceful, innocent victims of Brenda's petty thefts. But these peppers, they were tiny devils, growing brighter and angrier with each passing day, as if eagerly preparing for battle. Even watering them felt dangerous. Every droplet seemed to sizzle as it hit the soil, like tiny warnings of the fiery pain awaiting whoever dared disturb them. Of course, revenge gardening was no easy task. It wasn't long before the neighbors noticed my renewed dedication to my backyard hobby. Curiosity piqued when my previously casual gardening suddenly turned into an intense daily ritual. My neighbor Larry noticed my unusual enthusiasm one afternoon and cheerfully commented, "Wow, really getting serious with those tomatoes now, aren't you? Going for Neighborhood Gardener of the Year." I laughed nervously, feeling as guilty as if I'd been caught plotting a bank heist. Larry didn't need to know about my pepper sabotage, but his good-natured teasing left me momentarily paranoid, wondering who else had noticed my sudden change. Then came the truly unexpected complication. Brenda herself decided to pay another visit. It happened just as I finished covering up the peppers with carefully placed leaves, masking them to blend naturally with the tomatoes. I barely had time to admire my camouflage work before Brenda's voice cut sharply through the quiet afternoon air. "Interesting choice of fertilizer," she announced, peering skeptically over the fence with her eyes narrowed suspiciously. Her miniature poodle, Duchess, wore an expression equally judgmental. I turned around slowly, a forced smile plastered on my face, heart racing like I'd been caught red-handed committing a crime, which technically I hadn't, but still. "Just experimenting a bit," I responded casually, hoping my voice didn't betray the frantic thoughts racing through my mind. Brenda took a dramatic step closer, clearly determined to deliver another of her infamous, unsolicited gardening lectures. "Well, just remember," she said, holding her finger up dramatically as though reciting some ancient gardening wisdom. "Community guidelines clearly state that all plants must be aesthetically pleasing and non-hazardous." She paused theatrically, letting the words hang heavily between us. "Wouldn't want to accidentally poison anyone, now would we?" she added, arching an eyebrow knowingly, as if she'd suddenly acquired psychic powers revealing my secret plot. I laughed nervously again, the sound coming out far more suspicious than intended. "Of course not, Brenda," I reassured, silently praying she'd leave before noticing my shaky hands and guilty expression. She narrowed her eyes, scanning my garden like a trained investigator seeking evidence of wrongdoing. But after a tense moment, she finally retreated, leaving behind only the lingering scent of lavender perfume and passive aggression. After Brenda's nerve-wracking visit, I decided it was time to accelerate my plans. I obsessively monitored my pepper's growth over the following days, practically counting every new leaf and pepper pod. When the reapers finally ripened, vibrant red and bursting with deadly heat, my excitement hit fever pitch. Carefully, I moved the hottest peppers into prime positions near the tomatoes, strategically placing them so their fiery beauty would prove irresistible bait. The peppers gleamed invitingly under the sunlight, seemingly innocent, yet sinisterly dangerous. The stage was finally set. But catching Brenda required more than pepper plants alone. My security camera, now upgraded with motion-activated alerts sent directly to my phone, became my constant companion. Each night felt like a stakeout, my nerves fraying as I monitored live footage from the comfort of my living room. Every rustle of leaves or flicker of movement made my heart race, but night after night passed without action. Impatient and frustrated, I began questioning whether Brenda had discovered my plot or had simply lost interest. Then one evening, just as exhaustion threatened to claim victory, my phone buzzed aggressively with an alert. I nearly spilled my coffee in shock, grabbing the device with sweaty palms and opening the camera app with breathless anticipation. The blurry black and white footage revealed a shadowy figure slipping quietly through my garden gate. Adrenaline surged through me. Finally, this was it. But as the figure moved closer, I noticed something off. This person was smaller, clearly younger, not Brenda's unmistakable figure. Confused, I watched as the intruder, a teenager from down the street, grabbed a tomato and casually bit into it, only to recoil dramatically, dropping it and frantically fanning their mouth in pain. Part of me felt guilty watching the teenager's frantic dash toward the garden hose, desperate to soothe the fire now scorching their mouth. The other part, admittedly the petty side, felt a strange sense of satisfaction at seeing my peppers achieve their intended purpose, even if this thief wasn't my main target. Yet, catching the wrong thief was no victory. Worse, Brenda remained untouched, probably plotting another strike, oblivious to the fiery fate narrowly avoided by the teenage intruder. I realized I had underestimated how popular garden theft had become. My tomatoes were apparently the neighborhood's hottest underground attraction. Clearly, I needed to rethink my strategy before my garden became the neighborhood snack bar. Then another unexpected twist occurred. Brenda confronted me again, this time with complaints about my gardening practices directly from the HOA handbook, accusing me of overcrowding plants and causing visual disorder. She seemed genuinely irritated, as though personally offended by my garden layout. "You've turned your garden into chaos," she declared with exaggerated horror. "How can anyone appreciate neighborhood harmony looking at such unruliness?" Her exaggerated theatrics made it difficult to keep a straight face, but her words sparked an idea. If Brenda couldn't resist criticizing, maybe she wouldn't resist personally fixing my unruly garden herself. I smiled, nodding calmly, feigning compliance while secretly formulating a new plan. She had unknowingly shown me her weakness, her uncontrollable desire to control everything. Perhaps all I needed to do was leave things slightly messy, baiting her into acting herself. As Brenda marched away triumphantly, believing she'd won our latest exchange, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. My peppers weren't just a weapon. They were the perfect symbol of subtle rebellion against her relentless tyranny. Each day, my tomatoes and peppers grew closer to becoming the ideal trap, just disordered enough to attract her critical attention, yet innocent-looking enough to disguise the scorching truth. That evening, I rearranged the peppers openly, deliberately chaotic yet beautifully tempting. Each pepper practically glowed, their fiery promise hidden in plain sight. As I finished setting my new trap, I whispered confidently into the evening breeze, "Go ahead, Brenda. Come and get them." Little did I know how spectacularly my small act of defiance would soon unravel into a neighborhood-wide explosion of spice, drama, and hilarious chaos. Harvest Day arrived with a level of excitement and tension that made my morning coffee taste more like adrenaline. The sun had barely risen when I stepped outside. The air still cool, the garden glistening softly under a layer of dew. My Carolina Reapers glowed fiercely, tiny crimson warnings hiding innocently among the tomato plants. Each pepper was plump, vividly ripe, and deceptively beautiful, like brightly colored grenades waiting patiently to detonate. My heart raced at the thought of Brenda's impending spicy encounter, and I couldn't help but chuckle softly at the absurdity of it all. Who knew suburban gardening could turn into an undercover revenge thriller? Carefully inspecting each pepper, I imagined Brenda's reaction when her next tomato theft turned into a fiery disaster. Would she scream? Run down the street hysterically? Maybe even call an emergency HOA meeting? Each scenario felt both hilarious and satisfyingly justified. However, beneath my bravado, I felt a slight pang of guilt. Was I taking things too far? I quickly dismissed the thought. After all, it was Brenda who had repeatedly stolen from me. This was poetic justice, spicy poetic justice, really. With the stage set, I retreated indoors and began my vigil, eyes glued to my phone screen, patiently watching my live security feed. Hours passed without incident, leaving me restless and slightly frustrated. Doubts crept in again. Had Brenda somehow sensed my scheme? Was she deliberately avoiding the trap I'd set so carefully? Then, just as my impatience peaked, I saw her unmistakable silhouette emerge through the garden gate. My heart rate soared, my fingers tightening on my phone as I watched her every move. Brenda moved with exaggerated caution, looking around nervously, glancing toward my house repeatedly. She was hilariously dressed like a cartoon burglar, complete with oversized sunglasses and gardening gloves pulled up dramatically over her elbows. She crept toward my tomato plants with absurd stealth, as if fearing someone would leap from the bushes and shout, "Gotcha!" Yet here I was, safely hidden behind my curtains, phone in hand, capturing every amusingly incriminating moment. She reached confidently into the foliage, selecting a particularly vibrant pepper, mistaking it entirely for a juicy tomato in the dim twilight. My breath caught as she lifted it slowly, examining it briefly before casually biting directly into the pepper, her smug expression suggesting triumph at another successful theft. The reaction was instantaneous and spectacularly theatrical. Her eyes widened dramatically as she froze mid-bite, mouth slowly opening in shock. I leaned closer to the screen, completely mesmerized as Brenda's confident demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by wide-eyed panic. What followed was absolute chaos. Brenda let out a shriek loud enough to wake half the neighborhood, frantically fanning her mouth with exaggerated desperation. She stumbled blindly, clawing at the garden hose, managing only to spray water wildly into her own face and eyes. Her screams intensified, blending hilariously with the frantic sounds of water spraying everywhere but into her mouth. In a moment of pure comedic justice, her oversized gardening hat fell into the muddy flower bed as she flailed dramatically, losing all composure. Unable to hold back, I burst into laughter behind my window, feeling a mixture of sympathy and triumphant satisfaction. This was far better and far more hilarious than I ever imagined. Brenda staggered blindly toward the street, pepper juice tears streaming down her flushed cheeks, yelling something incoherent about poisoned tomatoes. Her miniature crime spree had ended spectacularly, yet tragically. She ran directly into Mr. Peterson, the elderly neighbor who had innocently stepped outside to see what all the commotion was about. In her pepper-induced frenzy, Brenda grabbed poor Mr. Peterson's freshly delivered newspaper from his hands, fanning her burning tongue like it was a fire extinguisher, which only seemed to worsen her predicament. Mr. Peterson watched helplessly, utterly confused by the strange scene unfolding on his quiet street. Moments later, Brenda sprinted down the sidewalk, eyes and mouth flaming with regret, screaming dramatically about betrayal, sabotage, and threats of legal action. By the time Brenda disappeared from my view, I was laughing uncontrollably, genuinely stunned by the comedic spectacle that had just occurred. But beneath my satisfaction, unease stirred. I knew Brenda wouldn't let this embarrassment go unanswered. She'd likely strike back with all the petty fury her HOA powers could muster. Yet, despite knowing the inevitable consequences, I couldn't deny the sheer joy I felt at finally seeing justice delivered, spicy justice. That evening, I rewatched the hilarious footage repeatedly, marveling at Brenda's dramatic performance, appreciating every comedic detail. I debated sharing it anonymously online, imagining it going viral, earning Brenda legendary internet fame, but ultimately decided against it, at least for now. Revenge was sweet, but public humiliation might escalate things too far. Or perhaps not far enough. I wasn't entirely sure yet. Still, As I lay in bed trying and failing to suppress fits of laughter, my phone suddenly buzzed. A notification appeared, an email from the HOA, titled ominously, Urgent Garden Incident. My stomach dropped, humor instantly replaced by dread. Opening the email, I found a formally worded notice, clearly dictated by Brenda, accusing me of maintaining hazardous gardening practices and threatening legal action unless immediate steps were taken to restore community safety standards. I laughed bitterly at the irony. Brenda was weaponizing HOA rules against me after stealing my tomatoes in the first place. This new twist complicated things significantly. It wasn't just a silly neighborhood dispute anymore. It was turning into an absurd legal drama. Brenda, ever persistent, refused to accept defeat, instead escalating the conflict further. I realized my humorous revenge had unintentionally triggered a new battle, one fought not with garden tools, but with HOA rules and regulations. Determined not to let Brenda control the narrative, I carefully prepared a counter-response, including the video as evidence, clearly showcasing Brenda's own illegal tomato theft. Still, I knew things had escalated beyond tomatoes and peppers. Brenda's pride was wounded, and she wouldn't retreat easily. As I sent the email, I wondered anxiously about the storm I just unleashed. What began as simple gardening rivalry had spiraled quickly into something far larger, something neither of us fully controlled. That night, sleep eluded me, my mind swirling with possibilities of what awaited next. The once innocent garden dispute had erupted into a full-scale neighborhood drama, peppered with humor, spice, and revenge. I knew one thing for sure. The coming days would be far hotter than I'd ever imagined. The aftermath of Brenda's spicy encounter spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip at a PTA meeting. By morning, whispers and laughter filled every sidewalk and driveway, and neighbors exchanged knowing glances over coffee mugs and watering cans. Brenda had inadvertently become a legend, part tragic victim, part comedic villain. Even those who had previously supported her strict HOA policies were finding amusement in the image of Brenda running blindly through sprinklers, screaming dramatically about poisoned tomatoes. Yet beneath the laughter lay tension. When I stepped outside, the once friendly neighborhood felt oddly polarized. On one side, neighbors who'd secretly resented Brenda's authoritarian rule offered covert thumbs up or approving nods, while others shot disapproving stares, clearly loyalists upset at what they saw as an unjustified attack on their beloved HOA leader. Larry, my usually neutral neighbor, stopped me on the sidewalk, looking amused yet concerned. "You know, she's not going to let this go easily, right?" he whispered conspiratorially. I sighed deeply, already aware that Brenda's revenge was imminent and likely severe. Sure enough, less than 24 hours after the incident, an official HOA letter landed ominously on my doorstep. I stared at the thick envelope like it was an unexploded bomb, hesitating before finally opening it. The language was aggressively formal and full of ominous legal jargon, accusing me of deliberately cultivating hazardous plants in violation of community safety guidelines. The letter demanded my immediate appearance at an HOA hearing scheduled just 2 days away, ominously titled Review of Garden Safety and Neighborhood Standards. Feeling both irritated and slightly nervous, I recognized Brenda's revenge strategy, weaponizing HOA regulations. Instead of backing down after her embarrassing pepper juice meltdown, she was doubling down, intent on framing herself as an innocent victim of my supposed horticultural negligence. The irony felt painfully absurd. My innocent tomatoes had been systematically stolen by Brenda herself, and yet I was now the villain in this surreal suburban drama. Determined to fight back, I prepared carefully for the hearing, meticulously gathering evidence. Armed with video footage clearly showing Brenda stealing my tomatoes, plus footage of her hilariously unfortunate pepper incident, I felt confident I could expose her hypocrisy. I rehearsed my arguments repeatedly, confident that justice would surely prevail. After all, facts were on my side, weren't they? When the evening of the hearing arrived, I walked into the community center brimming with cautious optimism, only to immediately sense tension thicker than stale cafeteria coffee. Brenda sat at a long table, wearing oversized dark sunglasses indoors, clearly still suffering from her pepper ordeal, but dramatically exaggerating her victimhood. Flanked by loyal HOA board members, she watched my every move, radiating smug confidence despite her obvious discomfort. The meeting began promptly, and Brenda launched immediately into an emotional, dramatic testimony filled with exaggerated accusations. Her voice trembled theatrically as she described the peppers as dangerous weapons disguised as innocent tomatoes, dramatically claiming she'd suffered emotional trauma, physical injury, and permanent distrust of all gardening activities. She paused repeatedly for dramatic effect, dabbing at imaginary tears with tissues, ensuring everyone present fully appreciated her suffering. I suppressed the urge to roll my eyes, instead calmly awaiting my turn to speak. When finally invited to respond, I stood and confidently presented my case, explaining my innocent tomato-growing hobby that had been repeatedly sabotaged by Brenda's petty thefts. I carefully described the escalation, even showing the camera footage as undeniable proof of Brenda's repeated criminal activities. As the footage played, murmurs rippled through the audience. Some neighbors gasped dramatically. Others stifled laughter at Brenda's visibly uncomfortable reaction to watching her own spicy downfall replayed on a big screen. Just as I expected victory, Brenda dramatically interrupted, her voice rising sharply, claiming my footage had been doctored and manipulated to frame her unfairly. Her bold accusations stunned everyone, including me, turning an already heated meeting into a chaotic shouting match. Soon, neighbors who'd remained quiet began passionately taking sides. Arguments breaking out across the community center, accusations and counter-accusations filled the air, rapidly escalating into an absurd spectacle, transforming our quiet suburban meeting into something resembling a chaotic courtroom drama. But the biggest shock was yet to come. Brenda, with a flourish worthy of a daytime soap opera, pulled from her oversized purse another envelope, triumphantly declaring she had official testimony from a horticultural expert claiming that my peppers were not only hazardous, but potentially illegal under local agricultural regulations. Gasps echoed through the room as she dramatically waved the envelope, demanding immediate disciplinary action against me. Her supporters applauded enthusiastically, clearly believing victory was finally within Brenda's grasp. My heart sank, panic rising rapidly. This was unexpected and serious, potentially transforming my simple act of revenge into genuine legal trouble. How had Brenda escalated something so trivial into a legitimate threat against me? Frustrated and bewildered, I struggled to respond, stumbling briefly under the weight of her accusations. Then, just when things seemed darkest, a surprising ally emerged. Eleanor, the normally mild-mannered HOA secretary who rarely spoke during meetings, abruptly stood, capturing everyone's attention. Calmly and confidently, Eleanor confessed she'd personally witnessed Brenda repeatedly trespassing into my garden and removing tomatoes weeks earlier. Brenda turned ghostly pale as Eleanor detailed each incident with stunning clarity, her quiet voice lending undeniable credibility. Eleanor's unexpected intervention dramatically shifted the room's mood. Many neighbors previously silent began openly questioning Brenda's integrity, murmuring disbelief at her blatant dishonesty. Caught completely off guard, Brenda frantically attempted damage control, denying Eleanor's claims, desperately accusing her of collusion and betrayal. Eleanor simply shook her head sadly, quietly stating, "Brenda, everyone deserves tomatoes and peace." Her words echoed through the now silent room, prompting scattered laughter and nodding agreement. Suddenly exposed and humiliated, Brenda stumbled emotionally through her closing statement, attempting to maintain dignity despite clear defeat. The board, clearly shaken by the unexpected turn of events, announced they'd review all evidence privately before rendering their final decision. The meeting ended in intense uncertainty, neighbors filing out in hushed groups, whispering speculation about the outcome and implications for Brenda's future. Returning home that night, I felt strangely unsatisfied despite the victory. Brenda's manipulations had severely damaged neighborhood trust, creating deep divisions and tensions unlikely to fade quickly. My revenge, though hilarious at first, had sparked consequences far beyond my control. As I lay awake contemplating the bizarre, dramatic events, I realized one thing clearly. This gardening feud was no longer just about tomatoes or peppers. It had become a battle for the heart and soul of our neighborhood. Little did I realize that the biggest twist was still ahead, hidden quietly beneath the soil of our seemingly innocent suburban gardens. The neighborhood had transformed. What was once a quiet, picture-perfect suburban community had turned into something resembling a Cold War battleground, with alliances forming, quiet tensions bubbling, and an unspoken rivalry simmering beneath every morning wave and forced smile. The fallout from the HOA meeting had been worse than I expected. Brenda had retreated temporarily, no doubt licking her wounds and plotting her next move, but the damage had already been done. Lines had been drawn. There were those who sided with her, believing that my peppers had been a deliberate act of neighborhood terrorism, and those who stood by me, amused yet supportive of my fight against Brenda's reign of suburban tyranny. The strangest and most unexpected outcome was the neighborhood's sudden collective interest in gardening. Almost overnight, yards that had once been barren were now sporting vegetable patches, raised beds, and carefully cultivated flower gardens. It was as if my battle with Brenda had awakened a suppressed competitive streak in every homeowner, each determined to prove their own gardening skills. Larry, who once barely watered his lawn, had set up a full greenhouse in his backyard, complete with irrigation and exotic plant species. The Millers, an elderly couple who previously only grew decorative shrubs, were now deep into tomato farming, their front yard lined with neat rows of meticulously labeled plants. Even Eleanor, the surprise hero of the HOA meeting, had started growing chili peppers, proudly displaying them in her window boxes like a collection of miniature trophies. Brenda, of course, did not take kindly to this gardening revolution. While I hadn't seen much of her since the HOA meeting, her presence was still felt in the form of a never-ending stream of emails, complaints, and suspiciously timed HOA violation notices. She couldn't outright ban gardening, especially now that half the neighborhood had embraced it, but she was trying every bureaucratic trick in the book to make my life miserable. A complaint about excessive plant growth encroaching on public space arrived in my mailbox one morning, referring to my perfectly contained tomato plants. Another notice cited improper waste disposal because a single fallen leaf had landed on the sidewalk. It was a slow, passive-aggressive battle, and I could see what Brenda was doing. She wasn't going to win in public anymore, so she was trying to drown me in technicalities, chipping away at my patience until I gave up. But I wasn't going to give up. If Brenda wanted a war of persistence, I was more than ready. The problem was that my initial plan, growing Carolina Reapers as a harmless prank, had already reached its peak. I needed something new, something that would strike back at Brenda in a way that she couldn't counteract with HOA rules and technical complaints. That's when inspiration struck me in the most unexpected way possible. It happened at the farmer's market. I had gone there for something completely unrelated, just looking for fresh produce since my own garden was now too risky to harvest without Brenda breathing down my neck. As I walked past the various stalls, I overheard a conversation between two farmers discussing crossbreeding techniques for chili peppers. One of them casually mentioned a new hybrid they were working on, a cross between a ghost pepper and a Carolina Reaper, meant to be even hotter than either parent. My brain immediately latched onto the idea, my imagination running wild. What if I took this gardening feud to the next level? What if I engineered something so potent, so impossibly hot, that it would serve as the ultimate warning sign to Brenda and anyone else who dared to mess with my garden? I spent the next few days researching everything I could about chili pepper hybrids, diving into gardening forums, and watching endless videos on crossbreeding techniques. The process was fascinating, a blend of science and patience requiring careful hand pollination and weeks of monitoring. It wasn't something that could be done overnight, but the idea alone filled me with newfound determination. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about creating something legendary, a pepper so fierce that it would earn a place in history. Of course, getting my hands on the right plants was a challenge. Ordering Carolina Reaper and ghost pepper seeds was easy enough, but I needed a controlled environment to grow them without Brenda's interference. That's when Larry unexpectedly came to my aid. One afternoon, while I was inspecting my garden for any new signs of sabotage, he strolled over, hands in his pockets, looking unusually serious. "I know what Brenda's been doing," he said bluntly, "and I think it's time we hit back harder." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to elaborate. He grinned mischievously before revealing his grand offer. He had an old tool shed in his backyard, mostly abandoned, that could easily be converted into a mini greenhouse. He offered it to me, no questions asked, as a safe zone to grow my ultimate pepper hybrid away from Brenda's prying eyes. I was stunned. Larry had always been more of an observer in our neighborhood dramas, but now he was stepping in as an active participant. It seemed that even he had grown tired of Brenda's antics. We got to work immediately, clearing out the shed, setting up grow lights, and ensuring that the conditions were perfect for what I was about to cultivate. The secrecy of it all made it even more thrilling. While Brenda was busy bombarding me with HOA notices, she had no idea that just 2 houses down, the next phase of my plan was already in motion. Over the next few weeks, I carefully nurtured my hybrid peppers, watching as the seedlings took root, their small, unassuming leaves hiding the sheer potential they held. The best part? Brenda had absolutely no idea what was coming. She was still focused on trying to regulate my existing garden, unaware that I had taken the battle underground, literally. Each day, I saw her watching my yard, hoping to find something to report, while all the real action was happening right under her nose. The neighborhood, meanwhile, was thriving with its newfound love for gardening, adding yet another layer of irony to the situation. Brenda had started this war trying to enforce gardening perfection, and instead, she had inadvertently turned the entire community into plant-obsessed rebels. As my hybrid peppers continued to grow, I realized that this feud had become bigger than just me and Brenda. It had sparked something in the neighborhood, a defiance against the arbitrary rules that had controlled everyone for so long. People were questioning the HOA more, pushing back against Brenda's authority, and openly supporting me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The next HOA meeting, set to take place in just a few days, was shaping up to be another showdown. Except this time, I wasn't just fighting for my tomatoes or my peppers. I was fighting for every neighbor who had ever been fined for a mailbox that was the wrong shade of beige, for every homeowner who had received a citation for leaving their trash out 5 minutes too long. This had become something bigger than I ever intended, and Brenda, in all her scheming, still had no clue what was about to hit her. The night before the next HOA meeting, I stood in Larry's shed, staring at the hybrid peppers that had taken over the space like a tiny, vibrant army of rebellion. They were unlike anything I'd ever grown, small but fierce, their deep red and orange colors practically glowing under the artificial grow lights. They looked innocent, but I knew better. These peppers were time bombs. A single bite would bring an explosion of heat so intense it would make the Carolina Reaper seem like a bell pepper in comparison. It was both thrilling and slightly terrifying to know I had successfully cultivated something so powerful. The real question now was how to use it. As I carefully plucked a few of the best-looking peppers, my mind ran through 100 different scenarios. The original plan had been simple: get revenge on Brenda for stealing my tomatoes. But things had spiraled far beyond that now. Brenda had turned this into a full-scale war, manipulating HOA rules, using bureaucratic nonsense to try and crush me under a mountain of fines and violations. I was no longer just fighting for my garden. I was fighting for every person in the neighborhood who had ever been bullied by her ridiculous enforcement of HOA policies. And if I was going to win, I needed to make a statement so bold, so undeniable, that Brenda would have no choice but to back down. The next morning, I woke up to find a fresh HOA violation notice taped aggressively to my front door. This one accused me of operating an unapproved agricultural enterprise within a residential zone. I let out a short, humorous laugh as I crumpled the paper in my hands. Brenda was getting desperate. She had clearly run out of legitimate complaints and was now just making things up as she went. But she had no idea that today, I was bringing something much bigger to the table. As I walked toward the community center for the meeting, I noticed that nearly the entire neighborhood was headed in the same direction. The last meeting had been tense, but this one felt different. People weren't just here out of curiosity. They were here to take sides. Some murmured in hushed voices about Brenda's latest antics, while others whispered excitedly about my hybrid peppers, which had somehow become the stuff of neighborhood legend. Even those who had remained neutral up until now seemed to realize that tonight's meeting would be decisive. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Brenda sat at the front of the room, her sunglasses perched dramatically on her nose, as if she was still recovering from the trauma of her last pepper incident. She wore her usual pastel cardigan, but her body language betrayed her unease. Despite her attempts to maintain an air of authority, she knew she had lost control of the neighborhood, and for someone like Brenda, that was worse than any pepper juice suffering. The meeting started with the usual formalities, HOA board members droning on about finances and community updates, but everyone knew why they were really there. Finally, Brenda cleared her throat and launched into her latest complaint, her voice dripping with forced concern. "It has come to my attention," she began, "that certain individuals in our community have been engaging in hazardous gardening practices, endangering not only themselves, but also their neighbors. I believe it is our duty as responsible homeowners to ensure that our community remains safe and free from such reckless behavior." The room erupted in murmurs, some supportive, others skeptical. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable. Brenda turned toward me with an exaggerated sigh, as if addressing a particularly unruly child. "Mr. Thompson," she continued, using my full last name like a disappointed teacher, "your insistence on growing excessively spicy, potentially harmful crops poses a serious risk. Just last week, an unsuspecting teenager was," she paused for dramatic effect, "poisoned by your produce." I nearly laughed aloud. The teenager she was referring to had stolen from my garden and learned a hard lesson in not taking things that didn't belong to him. The fact that Brenda was trying to spin that into a crime on my part was both ridiculous and predictable, but I didn't need to defend myself. I had something much better planned. I stood up slowly, letting the tension build. "Brenda," I said calmly, "if you're so concerned about my gardening, then perhaps you'd like to participate in a little demonstration?" I reached into my bag and pulled out a small plate, revealing several of my new hybrid peppers sliced into bite-sized pieces. The room collectively inhaled, recognizing the fiery little devils for what they were. Even those who had never seen them before could sense that whatever was on that plate was no ordinary snack. Brenda's expression flickered between suspicion and bravado. "And what exactly is this supposed to prove?" she demanded, her voice slightly higher than before. I smiled. "Well, since you've taken such an interest in my garden, I figured you should at least know what you're talking about. These are the peppers you're so concerned about, and if you truly believe they're a danger, then surely you wouldn't object to testing one yourself." The room was completely silent. Every eye was locked onto Brenda. She hesitated, clearly caught between two equally terrible options. If she refused, she would look weak, but if she accepted, she was walking directly into my trap. For a moment, it seemed like she might back down, but Brenda had spent years crafting an image of authority, and she wasn't about to let me destroy it in front of the entire neighborhood. With a tight-lipped smile, she reached forward, plucked a single slice from the plate, and popped it into her mouth. The result was instantaneous. Her face turned a shade of red so vivid it almost matched the peppers themselves. Her eyes widened in pure, unfiltered horror as the heat slammed into her taste buds with the force of a freight train. She let out a strangled gasp, gripping the table for support. Beads of sweat formed instantly on her forehead, her carefully applied makeup beginning to melt under the intensity of the spice. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out, just a choked, wheezing sound as she fought against the fire consuming her from the inside out. The room, once tense, now erupted into uncontrollable laughter. People clapped, cheered, some even wiping tears from their eyes as they watched the once mighty Brenda reduced to a sputtering, helpless mess. She reached blindly for her water bottle, fumbling with the cap, but it was too late. The heat had taken full control. Larry leaned over and whispered, just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Guess those aren't HOA approved, huh, Brenda?" Her pride, now fully incinerated along with her taste buds, staggered to her feet and bolted from the room, leaving behind only her chair and what little remained of her dignity. The laughter didn't stop for several minutes, neighbors high-fiving and shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. As the meeting wrapped up, the HOA board quietly rescinded all of Brenda's recent complaints against me, citing a lack of legitimate evidence. Eleanor, ever the quiet observer, simply winked in my direction as she collected her papers. It was over. The war had been won, not with legal arguments or paperwork, but with the power of a single pepper. That night, As I sat in my backyard enjoying the peaceful quiet of my garden, I realized that this wasn't just about me anymore. The neighborhood had changed. The power Brenda once held over everyone had crumbled, replaced by a newfound spirit of defiance and independence. Gardening, of all things, had sparked a revolution. And as I bit into one of my own tomatoes, finally able to enjoy them without fear of theft, I couldn't help but smile.